Good afternoon to my U.S. history class. This is your first video. Hopefully there won't be too many of these. We're in an age when I don't have to do this so much, but I wanted to finish off the section of chapter 22 that we were on, and then we'll see where we go from there. Welcome to my dining room. If you hear noises in the background, it's probably my kids while they are older and should be quiet. They're probably not going to be. I hope this finds all of you well. I miss you very much. Miss being in the classroom every day. All right. I have a timer over here running because my video limit is 15 minutes. So we are going to try to stick with that. Here we go. All right, so what I found out yesterday was that we were right here. At least that's what Gerald told me. So if this is wrong, blame him. Anyway, I know we had been talking about Pearl Harbor in class. We had watched the video about Pearl Harbor and the survivors and that kind of thing. So I think we're in about the right spot here. So that attack occurred on December 7th of 1941. That is one of those dates you need to remember. You will see that again. December 7th, 1941. And the title of this slide, Isolation and Infamy, puts together those two thoughts that are going on right here. Remember, the United States really, really wanted to be isolationist. They wanted to stay completely out of the rest of the world's war. But after the attack on Pearl Harbor, FDR called it a day that will live in infamy. And of course, that's being famous for all the wrong reasons. And it definitely was. It's a day that those who were alive on that day will never forget. Of course, there's very few, left who do actually remember Pearl Harbor. My grandparents do, but my parents do not. So you guys would have to go back to great-grandparents at least to find somebody who remembered. Okay, so on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, there were two waves of attack. One came through about 7-something in the morning, and the next one an hour later. Many ships or planes were damaged. Over 2,400 Americans were killed, and that was not just soldiers, but it was mainly soldiers and Navy personnel. And it was followed shortly by other conquests of the U.S. and British bases in the Pacific. It wasn't just Pearl Harbor that was attacked that day, but other bases around the Pacific. Okay, this is a picture of Pearl Harbor, and I am going to go pretty fast through this, knowing that you guys have a pause button, so you can stop and write and re-listen if you need to. When I get to the end of the video, I will post a short quiz that you can take or a question that you can answer where we'll start a discussion about what I'm covering in the video. That's just so I can make sure that you are continuing your work at home. And if you have any problems or questions, you just drop me an email. I'm sitting here waiting for your emails to come through. Not really, but in theory I am. Okay? So this is another picture from Pearl Harbor. All right, so the Pearl Harbor attack was not a complete success for the Japanese. While it did catch the Americans off guard, somewhat off guard, it wasn't a complete victory for Japan because they missed all of our aircraft carriers. All of the aircraft carriers were out at sea, doing their thing, practicing maneuvers, different things like that. They were not at Pearl Harbor, so none of them were damaged. Had they been, it would have taken much longer to recoup those losses. They did not completely destroy Pearl Harbor. Well, that's another good thing. And the other bad thing about what Japan did is they united the American nation to enter the war, where before some wanted to go ahead and enter and others thought it was premature and that we shouldn't. After Pearl Harbor, there was no question. Everybody wanted to go to war. Well, there's an exception to that, but we'll get to that in just a minute. And he, as I said, he called it a date that would live in infamy. The declaration of war quickly followed. On December 8th, 1941, FDR asked a joint session of Congress to declare war. It was a unanimous, except for one, vote in Congress. There was one lady, her name was Jeannette Rankin. She represented the great people of Wyoming, and she voted no to enter the war, but she did it because she was a Quaker, and she firmly believed in not going to war. So it was a religious conviction that caused her to vote against it. Very soon after Pearl Harbor, we had the fall of the Philippines. Of course, many of you would be familiar with Douglas MacArthur, was appointed as the chief before Pearl Harbor, was in charge of all the forces in the Pacific realm. And he was at Pearl Harbor, not at Pearl Harbor, but he was at the Philippines when Pearl Harbor fell. And he had to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. MacArthur was ordered to leave from there, and he did so. He left many men behind, and he promised the Filipino people that he would return, and he did indeed do so. Of course, the men that were left in the Bataan Peninsula were forced to march from the one end. I can't remember how far it was. It was miles and miles that they were forced to march. The Bataan Death March, approximately 10,000 of the 78,000 prisoners died in the Bataan Death March. As I told you guys in class the other day, I had a friend who used to come talk to my students for me who actually was part of that Bataan Death March, and he wouldn't talk about it. It was so traumatizing to him that even 65, 70 years later, he couldn't talk about it. Men who fainted or fell over were left where they were. It was a terrible way for Japan to treat prisoners of war. And it was against the international rules of law anyway, but they didn't really care. All right, so let's talk about Corregidor. Corregidor was another American stronghold, and it fell rather quickly, making the fall of the Philippine Islands complete. So when was our first strike against Japan? Well, that would have been the Doolittle raids. There's a great movie about it. I can't remember what the name of it is, but I will look for it. But I think it's called the Doolittle Raiders. Really, really good. Jimmy Doolittle was the leader of that raid. They led bombing expeditions into Tokyo and other cities. It was just a group of aircraft men, air fighters who flew into Tokyo, dropped bombs, and flew out. That was really all they could do. They were supposed to land in China, but that didn't work. I think it was a weather issue that caused that not to work. They couldn't get all the way to China and land, even though that was what they were scheduled to do. But the fact that the raids were successful in bombing Tokyo encouraged many Americans and helped lift the spirits of the American people back at home watching the war take place. And it did surprise the Japanese. That was always a good thing too. Of the 80 men who went on the raid, according to your book, 3 men were killed and 8 were captured by the Japanese. Of those 8 that were captured, 4 of them died in captivity, and the other 4 were eventually released. 1 plane landed in the Soviet Union, where the crew was imprisoned for 13 months, even though the Soviet Union was our ally. You can't really trust the Soviets. Okay, let's go to the Battle of Midway. This is where we start that island hopping process back to attack Japan. The Japanese advance towards Australia was stopped at the Battle of the Coral Sea. And then the Battle of Midway. This is a major turning point in the war. This is the first time in the history of war that 2 ships fought each other that they were so far apart they couldn't see each other because they were using aircraft. The Japanese were not aware that by that point we had broken their radio codes. So that is why we were more successful in that battle. The U.S. Admiral Chester Nimitz directed the war. In that war, we destroyed 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, 1 cruiser, and about 250 airplanes. More than 3,000 Japanese fighters died. I'm going to skip that one. It was an outstanding victory for the United States, but Tokyo is still very far away. We've got a long way to go in this war. And the Pacific side of the war is going to be particularly brutal for the Americans. On the home front, let's talk about that for just a little bit. I got about 4 minutes left. Each citizen should be a soldier was the rallying cry at home, that we all had to do our part back here. Of course, I'm saying we, but I wasn't alive then. War was won on the field and in the factory, meaning they couldn't do their job if those of us who stayed home didn't do ours. And that was the way every American looked at it. It was really a time of national unity like nothing we've ever experienced. We did see something similar to this at 9/11, but since then, we have not had the national unity that we had in World War II. Some individual freedoms were surrendered. Yes, we get that. That has to be the case in war sometimes. And we're experiencing some of that now. We don't have the freedom to go out and do what we thought we should be able to do because we're trying to protect some of our most vulnerable citizens here. So I think you all can kind of grasp this idea that we had to give up some of our individual freedoms in order for all to be successful. And the government did begin regulating the economy much more stringently then, and I think we might see some of that starting around here in the coming days as well. All right, so mobilizing the economy, the War Production Board was the one who was making sure that factories switched over to producing wartime goods, things like nylons. You guys probably don't even know what those are, but all the women wore nylons then, those were not available because that material was needed for other purposes like parachutes and stuff like that. So a lot of construction ceased in America, and consumer goods were not produced in the quantity and quality that they once had been, so that we could get those products overseas to our soldiers. We also had rationing. You couldn't buy shoes and tires and gas and food items anytime you wanted to. You had to have a ration book, like the one pictured here. And if you had the ration book and the money to buy it, then you could get it. But you had a coupon in that book that said it was good for, a pair of shoes. So then your family had to decide who needs shoes the most, and that person would go get them. We also did a lot of recycling at that point, especially glass items. Okay. 15 million Americans served in the military. 268,000 of those were women, and men between the ages of 18 and 45 could be drafted. So that was quite a bit of men there. Go ahead. Many more women entered the workforce, and of course, I saw recently that the woman who posed for the poster of Rosie the Riveter has recently passed away. That was a position. A lot of women went into the factories and worked for factories to make sure that this work was done. Okay, so I'm going to have to stop there, and I will get on to, I'll do one more video as the second one.